Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Messianic Bible Study with me, Zeli. I hope you all had a wonderful week this last week. I know I did, and I don't have anything else to say, anything more personable to say. So let's just jump right into it. Today, we are continuing in Exodus. We're starting in Exodus 24. So let's just jump right into it. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel, who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient." And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. And he said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them." Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain, in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Now, there we go. An interesting chapter, to say the least. So, then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar." Well, this is the beginning of the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was composed of 70 elders of Israel, and these elders would have been elected by both man and by Moses. It was sort of like a dual election. And they are going to worship from afar. And what this means is come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. What it means is that they're going like part way up the mountain. But of course, nobody else is even supposed to touch the mountain. And so there's a bit of a difference. They are distinct from the rest of Israel. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. Now, this is actually pretty interesting because presumably Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, they are going to be priests eventually. Well, interestingly enough, Eleazar is not mentioned, but that's probably because Nadab and Abihu might be the oldest of Aaron's sons, and so they are presumed to be next in line before they die and Eleazar takes over. But Moses alone shall come near to the Lord. And this is particularly interesting because this is a mountain. This is God's mountain that he's dwelling on. And this distinguishes this mountain from like the temple, let's say, because the glory of God was not at all times in the temple. There was a bit of a distinction. there the glory of God would rest in the temple when it had been atoned for. And this is why you would atone for the temple, is to get it prepared for God to come down and judge on the Day of Atonement and make atonement for the people of Israel. And so that's what happens in the temple. Like, God's not there at all times. The reason that you would be put to death is just because God's not there. His two cherubim are there. They are behind the curtain, and they are over the mercy seat, or let's say they compose the curtain and they are over the mercy seat. And so these cherubim are sort of like throne room guardians. And the reason for that is because the temple is a throne room. It's God's throne that is above the mercy seat. The mercy seat, we say, is a footstool of God. And then his throne sits above it because his throne is invisible. But what that means is the throne is not always there. God's not always there. But he sits on his throne in order to judge the people of Israel on the Day of Atonement, or the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. But here on the mountain, God is there. And Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu are not able to come near to God. Normally, after all of this, after they're ordained, they'll be able to come near to God in the Holy of Holies one time a year. But that's not the case with Moses. And I have a theory about this, and I think it's because Moses represents or is a Melchizedek priest. And, before anybody, gets all up in arms, because they're like, well, the Melchizedek priest was only mentioned 3 times in the Bible. Once when it's some guy that Abraham knew, once when it's David, and once when it's Jesus. And so how can you say that Moses is a Melchizedek if it never says that? Well, it's sort of like saying I saw an animal. It had 2 legs covered in feathers, and the feet were webbed, and the neck was green, and it waddled into a pond. It was just some animal, though. And you would say, well, it's not a duck. And I say, well, I mean, it looks like a duck. And you would say, but you didn't say duck, and so it's not a duck. It's sort of like that. Moses is performing all the things that the Melchizedek does. And in fact, when Jesus dies, he takes the baton from Moses. And that's part of what makes him the Melchizedek, his death, taking the baton from Moses, and he becomes the Melchizedek. Jesus is the next Moses, and one of the major factors that makes him the next Moses is he is the initiator of the next covenant. What that means is Moses, here initiating the first covenant, is the pre-Jesus Jesus. In other words, Moses is the Melchizedek. But that's just sort of like one layer. Another layer is that Jesus goes to the heavenly temple and operates in the heavenly temple as a priest. The reason he operates in the heavenly temple is because he's a priest. And what he does there is he intercedes for us. So to God, so that God forgives us. Now, Moses is able to go to the top of the mountain. Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu only go partway up the mountain. So this is sort of like the ascension up to the place where God dwells, the heavens. That's where Jesus is going. And this is actually particularly important to note here in this chapter, is he says, he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars, all that sort of stuff. And Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of Israel. So they see God's throne room. If you look at Ezekiel, if you look at any of the other places that mention God's throne room, it looks like this. There's a sapphire or a lake of lapis lazuli, and God sits on his throne right above there. So they are looking up at God. So then what happens? Well, Moses goes up to God. He goes to the throne room. Now, if the temple on earth is the earthly throne room of God, then what is the heavenly throne room of God? Well, it is the heavenly temple. And so the reason that Moses is able to tell people about the workings of the earthly temple, the tabernacle, is partly because God gives him a diagram, but also partly because Moses was there. He was able to pattern, and what God says to Moses is, pattern the earthly tabernacle according to the pattern which you saw of the heavenly temple on Sinai. So Moses is going to the heavenly temple. And later, after the sin of the golden calf, Moses is going to atone for the people of Israel. Not with any sacrifice, but he's just going to ask for God to forgive them. And that's exactly what Jesus does as our Melchizedek priest. So Moses is operating as a Melchizedek priest. And that's my theory. I am not going to die on that hill, but that roughly explains the reasons for my theory that he is Melchizedek priest, and that and that I'll say that. But again, I could be wrong. I always could be wrong. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. So all the stuff that we just heard from Exodus 20 to 23, that's what Moses is telling the people now. All the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Now, this is the second time they're doing this. Once they already did it in chapter 19. Now they're doing it here in chapter 24. And it's sort of a reconfirmation of the covenant. At first, they're like, whatever God says, we will do. Now they're like, now that we know that God said something, we will do it. It's sort of a bookend. So Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And they were not themselves doing the sacrifices, but they were bringing the sacrifices to Moses, and Moses was performing the sacrifices on their behalf. And it says, and Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. He then took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. So he keeps reaffirming the covenant. And this is in part where we get the idea of what a convert is supposed to go through, because that's what Israel is doing. It is a mixed multitude. Some rabbis say that 20% of the people that were present were descended from Israel, were descended from Jacob, whereas 80% were actually Egyptians that were converted, or some various other people that had seen what was going on and decided to join with the people of Israel. And so what they're doing, because none of them are part of this Mosaic covenant, this is going to be the pinnacle of covenants for the people of Israel at this time, and it's going to rest on top of the Abrahamic covenant, which was passed down to Isaac and Jacob, and that's going to be the foundation for this next layer of the covenant. And so you think about it sort of like this. It's a ziggurat. You have the lowest level, which is the Abrahamic covenant, and you could even say that a lower level would be like the Noahide covenant, or even lower than that, you might say the Adamic covenant. But ultimately, when we're talking about the people of Israel, when we're talking about like spiritual salvation, you are beginning with Abraham. Um, if you're talking about physical salvation, then yeah, you'd probably be beginning with Adam. So um, Abraham's covenant was the foundation. That is the fundamental covenant of spiritual salvation for the whole world. Which, by the way, is the sign of that covenant is circumcision. So, you got to wrestle with that one. The next one is going to be, and that covenant is passed to Isaac and then to Jacob and to Jacob's descendants. However, you have all of these mixed multitude attaching themselves to Jacob. And so Moses has given them rules and saying, okay, all this mixed multitude, they cannot do certain things unless they get circumcised, meaning they attach themselves to the people of Israel. And then here Moses is saying, he keeps reiterating, these are the laws, these are the laws, these are the laws. This is the covenant that God is making you. This is the second layer of the covenant of spiritual salvation for the whole world, and specifically for the people of Israel. Because in order for the whole world to receive this covenant, they join themselves to the people of Israel. And in the modern version of a conversion, let's say a Jewish conversion, you have a couple components. You have circumcision, you have baptism, immersion, a mikvah. You have the some of the commandments. Sorry, it's going to be a little loud for a second. You have some of the commandments told to you, and then you have the declaration of intent to keep the commandments. And all of those happen in the presence of the elders, and then they mikvah you and circumcise you. And of course, there are a variety of opinions on like the order or at what point you actually become an Israelite, all that sort of stuff. That doesn't really matter. But here, this is what's happening. In chapter 19, Moses says, wash your clothes, wash your bodies, and don't come near your wives for 3 days, because the Lord is going to appear to you. Then in the sight of all the elders, Moses even says, where was it? He rose early in the morning at the foot of the mountain. Okay, he built an altar at the foot of the mountain, 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel, and he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrifices and all that. And then all this is happening in the sight of these 70 elders that had gone part way up. They are, or sorry, no, that happens a little later. Yeah, no, they went up. Now they're coming back down with Moses, and then they're going back up again. So all of these, this is in the sight of the 70 elders, and this is a national conversion, a corporate conversion of all the people there, and all of them with one voice are saying they're going to, it's a declaration to that the Lord Adonai Hashem is their Lord. Now, the interesting thing is in the New Testament, none of those get taken away. Like what Paul says, like people a lot of times they talk about Paul specifically removing circumcision, but he doesn't actually remove circumcision. And you might cite verses like Galatians 5 something, where he says, if you get circumcised, then Christ is of no effect. If you get circumcised, you cut yourself off from Christ. And Paul's doing he's using a rhetorical tool there. First of all, second of all, he's talking about as this strange circumcision that these very outlandish nationalistic Jews are proposing in their congregation, and these people are going to be rejecting Christ in the process. So of course, there's going to be that component. But even more than that, in Acts 16, Paul circumcises Timothy. Now, if his belief is that if you get circumcised, you lose your salvation, then why is he circumcising Timothy? He's making Timothy lose his salvation. The answer is that circumcision in the body, in terms of according to God's command, that's not an issue. It's the baggage of circumcision, especially in today's day. It makes it really clear when the only way you can convert is if you deny Jesus. So the conversion, the circumcision, is a token of denial of Jesus. And that's what Paul is talking about. He's not saying circumcision itself is wrong. He's not abolishing circumcision. That's a very silly thing, because what he's doing is he is utilizing Abraham as the mechanism of salvation. Abraham's covenant is the covenant that the people are entering into. At least that's primarily what's going on. And then they go through the rest of the process. So circumcision is going to be part of that. What Paul does say, though, is he says, you uncircumcised people, and this is in Romans 2, if your heart is circumcised, then your bodily uncircumcision will be counted as circumcision. Paul's not saying circumcision is useless or abolished. He's saying that the circumcision of the heart is what you need to focus on. And ultimately, that's the priority. And there's another, there are a variety of theories why Paul says the things that he says. One of the theories that I particularly like is the theory that Paul was believing that Jesus' return was imminent. It was going to happen in like 5 minutes. And so he's like, yeah, get circumcised, whatever. That's going to take a year. Jesus is going to be back by then. So don't do that. Just get the circumcision of the heart. When Jesus returns, your uncircumcision will be counted as circumcision, and focus on preaching the gospel. That's the big thing. Get people in. And a lot of people, some scholars actually believe that that's why he was focusing so much on the salvation part and almost entirely ignoring the sanctification part. Although he does talk about sanctification, like in Ephesians 2:10, where he says, you've been saved by grace through faith, and you have been entered into Christ so that you can be prepared for the good works that Christ has prepared from the foundation of the world. So the idea then is you're saved, but you're not saved by works. You're saved by grace so that you can do good works. And if you're doing good works, then you are looking primarily at the Old Testament to know what those good works are, because the New Testament wasn't written at that point. So moving back to this, circumcision is a part of the conversion process. It's even part of the new covenant conversion process, even though people ignore it. But then you have immersion. Well, the people of Israel, they immersed themselves 3 days before God came. It's the same thing with us, especially if you look at the church attitude through history about baptism. Baptism is, to the church, like the replacement of circumcision, meaning, yeah, you're saved before you get baptized, but get baptized. It's a really important thing. Like, yeah, it's one of the good works that you do. And so the conversion here in Exodus is one of those things. And then Moses, of course, he takes the blood of the covenant and he sprinkles it on the people. And this is what happens with Jesus. Jesus takes the blood of his covenant and sprinkles it on you. It's what you mean when you say, I am covered by the blood of Jesus. His blood covers my sins. All that is metaphorical stuff, meaning that Jesus inaugurated this new covenant in order for us to enter into life and to enter into this new covenant. And so there's the sprinkling. And then what Paul says a really interesting thing, and this is something that Christians miss a lot here in our modern times. Paul says, if you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, we skip the first part and just believe in our heart. Like, it's all about belief. But the first part is just as important. And it is declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. Now, if Jesus is your Lord, you're going to obey him. And this is exactly what the people of Israel are doing. The Hashem is Lord. Everything he says, we will do. That's what it means to declare Jesus as Lord. You're saying everything Jesus says, we will do. And so the person that is entering in, the convert that's entering into this covenant, is actually going through every layer of what Exodus is describing, but even in large part what the modern Jewish equivalent would be to a conversion process. Although to the Christian it happens like really quickly. Well, I shouldn't say that. To the Protestant, it happens really quickly. But if you talk to like a Catholic or to an Orthodox, Greek Orthodox person, they'll say it's a bit more of a process. But yeah, ultimately, on the declaration is when you are saved. On your belief in God is when you like enter into the covenant, and then entering into the community is a bit of a different process. It's very similar in Judaism. You have some rabbis saying that the final conversion is like at the very end, and then some rabbis say that the final conversion or the actual entrance into the covenant is at the beginning, and the rest of it is just the entrance into the community. And you see this in the debate between, well, I'm not going to get into that. Ultimately, there's a very similar debate, almost a parallel debate between Christians and Jews on this topic. And what we see here in Exodus 24 is this process. God entered into a covenant with these people upon their declaration. They had not done anything righteous to earn this covenant, besides declaring that God is their Lord. They made that declaration. Now, this gets into a discussion about what works are. And this is actually a really tricky topic, because when Paul is saying you're not saved by works, you're saved by faith, he's not saying that you are not saved by literally anything that you do. You declare that God is Lord and you're saved. What does that mean? It means you made a declaration. It means you did something. You said something. You did something, and this contributed to at least your side of the bilateral relationship between God and man. When this is a very Protestant way of thinking about things, but if you see a declaration to obey God as works, then you are missing what works actually are. When Paul is talking about works, he's not saying literally anything that you do is a work. He's saying that there are going to be people who are coming in and saying that you're not saved because you didn't do one thing or another thing. You're not saved because you didn't get circumcised. You're not saved because you didn't get baptized. You're not saved. Like, you are a false believer because you don't wear tzitzit or something like that. And he's saying they're idiots. You are saved upon your belief in God, and you're saved when you enter into a relationship with God. All of the stuff that you do as a result of that relationship, they're good to do. In fact, they're necessary to do. But those aren't the things that save you. It is exactly what happens here in Exodus. They are entered into the covenant upon the declaration that they will do what God tells them to do, even though they haven't done anything that God has, well, God told them to leave, to do unleavened bread, all that sort of stuff. But that's sort of secondary. And this is probably why Paul uses Abraham as an example instead of the people of Israel here. But the whole point is, and actually that's a really good point, because God called Abraham. He chose Abraham before he made a covenant with Abraham. God called him. Abraham answered and left Padan Aram. Abraham was God's person. He said, when he called him, he said, yeah, this is all the way back in Genesis 2. People who bless you, I will bless, and people who curse you, I will curse. Abraham is God's person before Abraham does anything. God says, leave. And then Abraham, as God's person, leaves. And so his behavior is a result of his salvation. And when we say salvation, we really mean becoming God's person. He is God's person now, which means he is saved now, which means now he is going to do what God tells him to do. And then God reiterates the covenant and introduces more aspects of the covenant as the relationship grows. And it's the same thing with us. Now, the people of Israel, God called them out of Egypt. They're God's people. God declared that they're his people even to Moses before they even knew that Moses was coming. I have heard the cry of my people in Egypt. There is people. They're saved, in that sort of sense. And then God sends Moses to the people to bring them out of Egypt, and they do all the stuff that God has told them to do as a result of them being God's people. And you know what? Those who decided to stay behind, not God's people anymore. So, by the time they get to Mount Sinai, they're entering into this reiterated covenant, into this next layer of the covenant as they grow closer to God, and God enters into a more personal relationship with them. It's at this point where God is going to start to dwell within the people. And it is not because they left Egypt, although that was part of it. It was not because they ate matzah, although that was part of it. It's not because they walked through the Red Sea, although that was part of it. And it's not because they washed themselves, although that was part of it. But it's because they declared everything that God says we will do. And it's at that point when Moses sprinkles the blood of the covenant on the people. And it's at that point where God increases his intimacy with the people. So Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of the oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So they're in the covenant now, and he's saying, okay, now let's keep this up. And it's not like they enter into the covenant and now they have absolutely no responsibilities, which is how a lot of Christian, especially Protestant theology seems to figure. But once you enter into the covenant, you have more responsibilities. Something that I always say when I'm preaching is, when you become a Christian, you're supposed to become a better person, not a worse person. So if you were at one point held to the standard of the commandments, and Jesus saved you because you could not keep those commandments because you were trying to in your flesh, now as he gives you the Spirit, you think he's going to also say, oh, by the way, those rules that I gave you, well, actually, those were just to show you that you're evil. And now that you are saved, you are allowed to break those rules, which show you that you're evil. It doesn't make any sense. It's silly. That's not how it is. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up And they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. The Lord said to Moses, oh, and they beheld God. And the reason that this is interesting is because Moses couldn't even look at God in the same way. And it makes you really wonder, like, oh, is this a contradiction? No, this is actually one of the evidences, in my opinion, of the compound unity of God. This God is Jesus. And the reason that it says they beheld God and ate and drank, and God didn't raise his hand on these people, is because the reason that they would die is because they are in royal, they're in the presence of royalty. It's the same thing that later in Esther, the whole dilemma is that Esther can't go into the throne room unless she's called by the king. It's the same thing here. God is a divine king. And so they enter into his throne room and God does not kill them. It's a different thing in Moses's, or in a few chapters, when God says to Moses, no man can behold me and live. And so he can only show Moses his the residue of his glory. That is the Ein Sof, in my opinion. That is the God that cannot even be comprehended. The God that cannot be anthropomorphized like the God here can. That is the one of the other parts of the compound unity of God. And so it's not a contradiction. It is an evidence, in my opinion, of God's compound unity. Meaning, when we say God is one, we mean we very much mean that he is a Trinity. The Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction. So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God, and he said to the elders, wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them. So Joshua goes up the mountain with Moses. We're not sure if Joshua went to the same, like to the highest point of the mountain like Moses did, or if Joshua only went another partial way. But we do know that some of Moses' authority is given to Joshua later. So I'm inclined to believe that he did not go all the way because it's only some of Moses' authority is given to him. But the interesting thing here in verse 14 is he says, wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Now, Aaron, of course, is going to become the high priest. Hur is descended from Judah. And forgive me, but I might get this wrong. It's either Joshua or it's Caleb who is Hur's son, which is very, very interesting. But Hur is a judge. He is one of the high judges. He's one of the elders of the 70 elders that came up with them part way up the mountain. And this is beginning to demonstrate the dual authority of the Levitical priesthood and the judiciary in order to explain the law and legislate. And later in the Bible, when Moses dies, and this is in Deuteronomy 17, 8 through 13, Moses is going to give the authority to try hard cases that in Exodus 18 was only reserved for Moses, and in Deuteronomy 1 is only reserved for Moses. He is going to give this capacity to the priest and judge. And it's sort of like Moses, his authority, part of his authority to interpret the law is given to the priest and judge, and these are the figureheads of the Sanhedrin, the 70 elders. And it's not all of Moses' authority is given to these people, but part of it is given to these people. And this is precursed. That's not the right word. It's typified here where he says, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them. Meaning they have this authority. And when Moses dies, all of that, like they're going to be the only people who have that authority. And then they're going to continue to legislate throughout the centuries until Jesus returns, and with the authority of Moses, in fact, an even higher authority, is going to correct the Sanhedrin. And he doesn't take the authority away from the Sanhedrin, which is a really interesting thing. Instead, he simply corrects them because they're just doing what they were commanded to do. That is, try hard cases. And if they got it right, then they continued to be right. If they got it wrong, then Jesus is correcting that. And the reason that this is actually important, like a lot of people might say, well, they're designed to try hard cases, to resolve disputes, not to legislate. But the issue with that way of thinking is it's a misrepresentation of what it means to try cases. British common law, for instance, the entire legal structure of the United States is built on cases that have been tried. And the precedent that is then established by those cases between two people who have a particular right, and the one right is seen, or the one person is declared to be in the right, and the other person is declared to be in the wrong, or one right is seen as greater than the other right, that becomes precedent and law that judges then use to determine future trials, to determine the outcomes of future trials. So what Moses is setting up here is common law. It is, they're going to try disputes. That's going to produce precedent, and that's going to then be authoritative for the people who are under these judges. Which is, oh, and then of course, because they're judges, they're also going to be, they are the legal experts. So they're going to be teaching the people the law. That's going to be their job. And so essentially what we have here is one side of the oral law, which is the capacity for the judges to write oral law. The other side is the what Moses meant, and that's what Jesus comes to reassert. Now, when Jesus comes, and this is found in Hebrews 7, Hebrews 7 says that the Levitical priesthood was weak and ineffectual. Let me just go there, actually, because this is really fun. Let's go to Bible Hub. Whoops. Okay. Hebrews 7, and starting in verse 11. Now let's just go to ESV because that's the one that we've been reading from. Okay. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe. Okay, so all that sort of stuff. So this is one of those proof texts for the abrogation of the law. But because of the background that I have just mentioned, you should understand that it's not that simple. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, the perfection of what? Well, we're going back to Hebrews 6. We're talking about doctrine. We're talking about church doctrine, and here that the word for perfection and the word for maturity, they're conceptually linked. Now, therefore, let us leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity or perfection, not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith towards God, and of instruction about washing, the laying on of hands, the resurrection of the dead, and eternal judgment. And this we will do if God permits. For it is impossible in the case of those who have been once enlightened and all that sort of stuff. Though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure of better things, things that belong to salvation. For God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for his name in serving the saints, as you still do. What the author here is talking about is perfection. He's talking about maturity, and maturity meaning having advanced beyond these elementary doctrines and service in what we do. These are the more minute interpretations of what the law actually says. So if this maturity could have been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law. Now, why is that linked? It's because the Levitical priesthood is legislating via the Sanhedrin. For under it the people received the law. Now, what law is that? They didn't receive the law under Moses, or they didn't receive this Levitical law. The law that is talking about is not the law that we received under Moses, because we didn't receive the law of Moses under the Levitical priesthood. In fact, we received the entire law of Moses in Exodus before any priest was ever ordained. And so whatever law it's referring to, it's not referring to the first 5 books of the Bible. It's talking about the legal structure, or the not conglomerate, what's the word? It's talking about the laws that have been passed down to us through the legislative process of common law and of legislation that was under the authority of the Levitical priesthood that Moses gave to the Levitical priests and the judges. In other words, it's talking about oral Torah. It's not talking about written Torah. Now, if perfection, if maturity had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the oral Torah, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek? Meaning, all these people know about the issues with the Levitical priesthood in the Second Temple period. It had issues. It was very corrupt. It was corrupt enough for God to destroy the place. So it was bad. Obviously, perfection cannot be attained through them because they are flawed people. So therefore, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, which means king of righteousness, which would be Jesus, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. Which law? The oral law. How do we know that? Because that's a law it's talking about. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. Now, is that true? Technically, no, it's not true. David made sacrifices, so he technically served at the altar. But this is talking about like perpetually serving as priest, because David was a Melchizedek, Samuel was a Melchizedek. David's sons had priestly duties. and Solomon performed all these offerings. However, this is talking about a slightly different thing. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, meaning Jesus, who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, meaning Aaron, but by the power of an indestructible life, meaning because he's God and he is righteous. King of righteousness, Jesus is the King of righteousness, which, because he's God, means he is both the King of righteousness and has an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, the interesting thing here is Jesus, and the author of Hebrews knows this, Jesus did not change the Mosaic law. And how do we know that? Go to the next chapter, Hebrews 8, verse 4. Now, if Jesus were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. The interesting thing about the Torah is it never prescribes a Melchizedek priest. It never prescribes a priest who will go into heaven and serve that temple. You know, the same temple that Moses patterned the tabernacle after. Nobody's serving as priests up there. But now Jesus is. So if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. Why? Because the law forbids it. If he were, well, what does that mean? It means Jesus did not change the laws of the earthly temple. And you could say, well, it's because he abolished the temple. That is not true. The reason the text gives us is because there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. If Jesus did offer gifts in this earthly temple, it would be not according to the law. And that's why Jesus could not. It's because it would break the law. So when we go back to chapter 7, and it says, under the Levitical priesthood, we received the law, and Jesus changed to that. And then we move to chapter 8, and he says he could not change that, or he did not change that. You have a contradiction unless you understand that Jesus came to change the oral law, not by abruptly changing everything, not by abolishing any Mosaic law, but simply by asserting his authority as the Messiah, as the second Moses, who already had that authority. And because he died, that role in the hierarchy just vanished and didn't exist for 1,500 years. And then Jesus comes as a second Moses, and he just is that role. And then he goes up to heaven and he continues to offer sacrifices. Well, he continues to intercede for the people of Israel without a sacrifice, just like Moses did. Now, in verse 5, they serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. Now, if they serve a copy and a shadow, does that mean that the copy and the shadow is abolished? No. Why, how do we know that? Because if Jesus were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. Meaning the earthly stuff is not abolished just because Jesus goes to heaven. Rather, the two temples are working simultaneously, and they are connecting heaven and earth in the throne room of God. And that's how God designed it. It was how God designed it from the beginning. It's not that anything changed now that Jesus came. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. Now, the better promises are, there's absolutely no way that God's going to let you go. He is the one circumcising your heart, as opposed to telling you to circumcise your heart, and he's doing it en masse, as opposed to doing it for certain people at a time. For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. And this is found in Jeremiah, for he finds fault with him when he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, And so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. That is the better promise. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor, and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. Those are the better promises. Now it says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean the law has changed? No. This entire time we're reading Hebrews and it's saying, no, the law continues to be in existence. One law, that is the oral law, has changed because Jesus has asserted his right as authority as Moses, the second Moses. But that doesn't mean that anything in the law actually has changed, anything in the written law. It's simply that Jesus brought a better and perfect interpretation of that law, which is what the oral law is. And then you have a few things in here. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And then it changes. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. And why is that? Well, because you have all of these different prophecies where God is declaring that he is going to re-emerge the house of Israel and the house of Judah together, because he divided them. And Jeremiah is one of the primary sources for this reemergence prophecy. So no longer are they going to be Israel and Judah, but now they will all be Israel. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers. And what does that mean? It means it's going to be a new one. On the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant. So why is it not like the covenant that will be like the fathers? Because they did not continue in my covenant. So now when I make this new covenant, I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. They're not going to leave the covenant, in other words. And now this next part is interesting because it's taken from the Septuagint, but it's not taken from the Masoretic text. And what it says is, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. What does that mean? It means the people of Israel were forsaken. So why is this new covenant different from the old covenant? Because no longer will I show no concern for them. That is one of the major differences between the old covenant and the new covenant, is God will never again show no concern for his people Israel. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. Which laws? There's only one set of laws when Jeremiah says this and when Hebrews reiterates this. The Torah. I'll put my Torah in their hearts and in their minds. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. That is the reiteration of the covenant. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor, and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me. Meaning, like, you're not going to go tell a Jew, and a Jew's not going to go tell a Christian and argue with each other about things like this. But everyone's going to know the perfection of the covenant. Now, that hasn't happened yet. From the least of them to the greatest, for I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. You see, the interesting thing here is Jesus died and he went up to heaven, and he betrothed us. He instituted this new covenant, but it's a betrothal of the covenant. When he returns is when he marries us, and that is the full consummation of the covenant. The reason that some parts of the covenant have not been fulfilled yet is because we weren't ready. is because we weren't doing our job. He empowered us then to do our job, to do good works, to go out and preach this covenant to the nations. And what Paul says is he is waiting for the full number of the people to come in, is the reason he's delaying. And so it's our job to go out to the nations and bring people in so that he will hasten his returning. And of course, do good works so that he will hasten his returning. And then he will return and fully consummate the covenant with Israel, his people. And Jews and Christians are going to be united as one new Israel. And this is according to Galatians 3. There's no such thing as Jew or Gentile in the body of Christ. He's going to unite them all. And all this fighting is going to be never again. And so the Hebrews author says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. Now, you might think, well, if the first covenant is obsolete, is the law then obsolete? The answer is no. And how do we know this? Because of the author's reasoning. If the first one was obsolete, then that means it was obsolete in Jeremiah's day. But we know that's not true. Jeremiah was alive when the first temple was destroyed. Then God brought his people back to their land. So if it was obsolete, then it was obsolete in Jeremiah's day. But the fact that the first one is made obsolete does not mean that the law is obsolete. It merely means that the relationship between God and man, this second layer of the covenant, has a new layer laid on top of it. And this new layer has better promises. And all the curses of the second layer are now, at least when it becomes consummated, are never going to happen again. And that is when the Messiah returns and reigns for 1,000 years, and then God creates new heaven and new earth, and the world to come we are all brought into. And so, yeah, we should all be waiting for that to happen. But the fact that I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts is part of this covenant means that the law actually transfers. Because the laws are good, and we are called to do good. When we become Christians, when we become saved, we're supposed to become better people. And with that, I'm going to end. I hope you have a wonderful week. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can post them down there. And I hope you like, subscribe, and comment. So, yeah, have a good day.